Well, you want to do the interview with me, or do you want to watch?
I'll do it with you.
Oh, you want to do it with me?
Well done.
Okay.
Eric, will you help me grill your daddy? Should we ask him some questions?
For years, we knew Simon Cowell as the sharp judge who rarely showed emotion. Then, something changed. The same man who once built his name on brutal honesty began stepping away, quieter, softer, almost protective. Reports about his son, Eric Cowell, only deepened the mystery. Was this just fatherhood, or something far more serious behind the scenes? What is the one secret health crisis the Cowell family has been hiding, and why is the internet suddenly convinced young Eric is in danger? The viral hoax and the diagnosis rumor. If you've spent 5 minutes on social media lately, you've likely seen the tragic thumbnails, but how much of it is actually real? Because suddenly, the internet had a story, a heavy one, a heartbreaking one. Posts started popping up about Eric Cowell and a supposed rare illness, emotional titles, sad background music, clips of Simon Cowell looking serious, almost withdrawn. And just like that, a narrative was born. But here's where things get interesting. Have you ever seen a rumor travel halfway around the world before the truth even gets its boots on? Because that is exactly what happened here. The claim was simple but powerful, that Eric, Simon's young son, was facing a serious health diagnosis, something rare, something life-changing. The kind of story that instantly pulls at emotions and keeps people watching. And the more people watched, the more the algorithm pushed it. Before long, it didn't feel like a rumor anymore. It felt like a fact. But when you slow things down and actually look at the real information, the picture starts to shift. Eric Cowell, the same child at the center of these viral claims, has been seen in recent family moments looking active, playful, and healthy. In fact, those close to the family have consistently shown him living a normal life. No confirmed reports, no verified statements, no medical announcements, nothing that supports the dramatic headlines flooding social media. So what happened? How did a completely unverified story turn into something millions of people believed overnight? The answer is simpler than most people expect. Emotion sells. And when it comes to someone like Simon Cowell, a man the world has watched for decades, any hint of vulnerability becomes a magnet for attention. Think about it. This is the same man who built his reputation on being brutally honest. The judge who rarely softened his words on shows like The X Factor and Britain's Got Talent. For years, he was seen as untouchable, almost immune to emotion. Then, suddenly, people start noticing a different version of him, more protective, more present, more human. And that shift? It made people curious. Because when someone like Simon changes, people don't just notice. They start asking questions. They start connecting dots, even when those dots don't actually connect. And this is where the rumor took on a life of its own. Clips of Simon looking emotional were taken out of context. Old interviews were re-uploaded with new, dramatic titles. Even unrelated moments were edited together to create a story that felt real enough to believe. It wasn't one big lie. It was 100 small suggestions stacked together until they formed something convincing. But here's the truth that often gets buried under all that noise. The diagnosis everyone is talking about, it was never officially about Eric. And that changes everything. Because while the internet was busy focusing on a child who by all reliable accounts is doing just fine, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something quieter, something more personal, something that actually explains why Simon Cowell began to change. You see, becoming a father didn't just add a new role to Simon's life, it completely rewired him. He has openly spoken about how his son gave him a new perspective, a new sense of responsibility, a reason to slow down and rethink what truly matters. And when that kind of shift happens, it doesn't always come with loud announcements. Sometimes it shows up in small ways. The way someone speaks, the way they react, the way they step back from things that once defined them. So the real question isn't whether Eric is sick. The real question is, what actually caused this emotional shift in Simon Cowell? Because something clearly did. And if it wasn't the viral diagnosis everyone keeps sharing, then what was it? Was it a private scare that the public never fully understood? Was it something closer to Simon himself? Or was it a moment that forced him to confront something far deeper than any headline could capture? This is where the story starts to move away from internet noise and into something real. Because sometimes, the biggest transformations don't come from the rumors we see online. They come from the moments no one is filming, the conversations no one hears, the realities that don't trend but quietly change everything. And as we move forward, one thing becomes clear. The internet may have gotten the diagnosis wrong, but it wasn't completely wrong about one thing. Something did happen, something big enough to change Simon Cowell in a way the world couldn't ignore. So if the viral story isn't true, then what is the real diagnosis that shook him this deeply? And why has it stayed so carefully out of the spotlight? The girl who cracked the shell, the Julia Carlile story. To understand why people think Eric is sick, we have to go back to the night Simon Cowell finally lost his composure on live television. Because that moment, it didn't come out of nowhere. It happened on the stage of Britain's Got Talent, in front of millions watching at home, where emotions are usually controlled, polished, and timed perfectly for TV. But this time, something slipped, something real. And at the center of it all was a young dancer named Julia Carlile. At first, her story didn't look like the kind that would shake someone like Simon. She was talented, focused, and quietly determined, the kind of performer who lets her work speak before her words do. But behind that calm presence was a reality most viewers didn't fully understand at the time. Julia had been diagnosed with a serious spinal condition known as scoliosis. And this wasn't just a minor issue. This was the kind of condition that can slowly change your body, limit your movement, and in some cases, take away everything you've worked for physically. For a dancer, it's not just a challenge, it's a direct threat to your dream. Now think about that for a second. What would you do if you had millions of dollars and met a child whose only dream was about to be crushed by a medical curveball? Because that's exactly the position Simon found himself in. As Julia's story unfolded, the room shifted. The performance was no longer just about technique or timing. It became something deeper. A fight against something she didn't choose, something she couldn't control, but something she was determined not to let define her. And for the first time in a long time, Simon Cowell didn't look like the man people were used to. He looked affected. This is where everything changes. Because after the performance, behind the scenes and away from the dramatic edits, Simon made a decision that very few people expected. He didn't just offer words. He didn't just give encouragement. He took action. Reports revealed that Simon personally stepped in to fund Julia's life-changing surgery. Not a small donation, not a symbolic gesture. We're talking about a figure around $200,000, a full commitment to make sure she had access to the treatment she needed. And just like that, the narrative around Simon Cowell began to shift. But here's the part most viral videos don't explain properly. This was the diagnosis that triggered everything people are now talking about. Not Eric, not his son, Julia. The emotional reaction people saw on screen, the quiet change in Simon's demeanor, and the moments that felt heavier than usual, they were connected to real experiences like this. Encounters that hit closer than viewers realized. Stories that reminded him of something deeper than entertainment. But the internet did what it always does. It simplified it. Then it twisted it. Then it reassigned it to someone closer to him. Someone more emotionally powerful in the public eye. His son. And suddenly, a real story became a completely different story. Isn't it strange how the truth can be right in front of us, yet still get completely rewritten? Because when you look at the timeline, when you connect the actual dots, everything lines up differently. Simon's emotional shift didn't come from a hidden illness in his family. It came from moments like this, real human encounters that forced him to step outside his usual role, moments where he wasn't the judge. He was just a person watching someone fight through something incredibly difficult. And those moments stay with you. They change how you see things. They change how you react. They change how much weight you carry when you hear stories like Julia's. And once that door opens, it doesn't easily close. Because now, every performance, every story, every young contestant with a dream starts to feel a little more personal, a little more real, a little harder to brush off with a quick comment. That is the version of Simon Cowell that people began to notice. Not a man hiding a family secret, but a man who had quietly started feeling the weight of other people's realities in a way he hadn't before. And if you think about it, that explains a lot more than the rumors ever could. It explains the softer tone. It explains the protective energy. It explains why certain moments started hitting him harder than they used to. But it also opens up a new question. Because if Julia's story cracked something open in Simon, if it made him more aware, more emotional, more connected, then what happened next that pushed him even further to the point where people started talking about an emotional goodbye? Because stories like this don't just end with one act of kindness. Sometimes they trigger something much bigger, something that slowly builds in the background until it can't be ignored anymore. And that is exactly where this story starts to take a deeper turn. The 4 a.m. Demon, Simon's secret goodbye. While the world was looking at Eric, Simon was fighting a silent battle within himself, a goodbye to a life that was slowly wearing him down. And this is where the story shifts from what people thought was happening to what was actually happening. Because long before the rumors, long before the viral thumbnails, Simon Cowell was living a life that most people would not survive mentally. Not because it looked hard on the outside, but because of what it demanded behind the scenes. We are talking about a man who built an empire on control, precision, and constant pressure. A man who didn't just work long hours. He lived inside his work. There were periods where Simon would stay awake until 4 a.m., sometimes even longer, going through ratings, reviewing performances, and analyzing every detail. Not because someone told him to, but because he felt like he had to. Imagine that for a second. How long could you run on that kind of pressure before something inside you starts to crack? Because eventually, it did. Simon later admitted something that surprised a lot of people. Behind the success, behind the fame, behind the sharp persona everyone knew from The X Factor and Britain's Got Talent, there was a period where he was struggling internally, quietly, consistently. He described feeling low, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in a slow, heavy way that builds over time when your entire life revolves around work and nothing else. And this is the part most people never saw. The Mr. Nasty image? That was just one layer. Underneath it was someone running on empty. Before fatherhood, Simon's world had one main focus: work, success, ratings, winning. That was the cycle. That was the routine. And when you stay in that loop for years, even decades, it starts to shape how you think, how you feel, and how you live. There is a surprising detail many people overlook. There were times Simon would go days without proper rest, pushing himself just to stay ahead, just to keep everything running perfectly. It sounds impressive at first, but when you really think about it, it also sounds unsustainable, because no one can run like that forever. So what happens when someone who has built their entire identity around work suddenly realizes it is costing them something deeper? This is where the real goodbye begins. Not a goodbye to television, not a goodbye to fame, a goodbye to a version of himself. When Eric Cowell came into his life, everything started to shift. Not overnight, not instantly, but slowly, in a way that forced Simon to look at his life differently. He began to realize something simple but powerful. If he kept living the way he had always lived, he would miss the very moments that actually matter. And that realization, it hits harder than any rumor. Because what do you do when success gives you everything except time? Simon started pulling back, not dramatically, but intentionally. He began letting go of the obsession with working into the early hours. He stepped away from that 4 a.m. cycle that had once defined him. And that was not easy. People don't talk about this enough, but changing your lifestyle after years of doing the same thing is one of the hardest things anyone can do, especially when that lifestyle made you successful. It feels like you are walking away from the very thing that built you. But for Simon, it was not about losing something. It was about saving something. his time, his health, his connection with his son, and maybe in a deeper way, himself. Isn't it interesting how the world saw this as weakness, when in reality it was one of the strongest decisions he could make? Because from the outside, people noticed he was different, less harsh, more thoughtful, more present. And instead of asking what he was gaining, many assumed he was hiding something. That is how the rumors filled the gap. But the truth is far more grounded. Simon was not reacting to a hidden diagnosis in his family. He was responding to something internal, a realization that the life he had built was no longer the life he wanted to continue. And that is a much more powerful story. Because this was not a goodbye forced by tragedy. It was a goodbye chosen out of awareness. A decision to step away from the version of himself that worked endlessly without stopping. A decision to be present, not just successful. A decision to feel, not just judge. And when you connect this to everything we have seen so far, it starts to make sense. The emotional moments, the softer tone, the shift in energy. It was never about a single event. It was about a series of realizations building up over time until something had to change. But here is where things get even deeper. Because once someone starts changing like this, once they begin letting go of the old version of themselves, what happens when they are forced to face the consequences of how they used to live? Because walking away from a lifestyle is one thing. Facing what that lifestyle did to you, that is something else entirely. And that is exactly where this story takes its next turn. The mirror of empathy. And this is where the story takes a turn that most people completely miss. Why does a man who once made contestants tremble now look like he is holding back tears at the press of a golden buzzer? Think about it. There was a time when Simon Cowell built his entire reputation on being brutally honest. In the early 2000s, television thrived on that version of him. The sharp comments, the cold stares, the way he could shut down a dream in seconds. For many viewers, that was the entertainment. And for Simon, that was the brand. But something changed. Not slowly, not subtly. It was almost like a switch flipped. And the truth is, that switch has a name. Eric. When Simon became a father, he didn't just gain a son, he gained a mirror. A reflection that forced him to see the world differently. Interviews later revealed that fatherhood hit him harder than he ever expected. He admitted that his priorities shifted, his mindset softened, and for the first time in years, work stopped being the center of his universe. But here is the part most people don't connect. What if it wasn't just fatherhood, but fear? Because when you love someone that deeply, especially a child, something else enters the picture. Vulnerability. The kind that keeps you awake at night. The kind that makes every story about a struggling child feel personal. And suddenly, those contestants on stage are no longer just performers. They are someone's child. They are someone's hope. They are someone's everything. And that is where the mirror of empathy begins. You start to notice it if you go back and watch older clips versus recent ones. In the past, Simon would interrupt performances mid-song, sometimes with visible irritation. He wasn't interested in emotions. He wanted results, perfection, marketability. Now, watch him today. He listens longer. He leans forward. He asks questions. He connects. There are moments where you can actually see his expression change before he speaks, like he is processing something deeper than just the performance itself. And here is the real twist most people overlook. Every time Simon sees a vulnerable act, especially a child, especially someone dealing with illness or hardship, he doesn't just see a contestant. He sees Eric. That is the shift. That is why the golden buzzer moments hit differently now. That is why his reactions feel more emotional, more human, more real. Because in those moments, it is no longer just television. It is personal. Have you ever noticed how he reacts when a child talks about a medical struggle or a difficult home life? There is a pause, a silence that wasn't there before. Almost like he is imagining something he doesn't want to fully say out loud. And this is where everything connects back to the story people got wrong. The internet saw emotional moments. They saw tears. They saw compassion. And they created a narrative that Eric must be sick, that something tragic must be happening behind the scenes. But the truth is more complex. It is not that Eric broke him. It is that Eric woke him up. Fatherhood didn't introduce pain into Simon's life. It introduced awareness, a deeper understanding of what loss could feel like, what fear could look like, what love actually demands from you. And once you feel that, you cannot unsee it. So when a young performer steps on stage carrying a story that could have ended differently, Simon feels it in a way he never did before, not as a judge, but as a father. And that changes everything. Now let me ask you something. If you had spent years building a career on being emotionally distant, and then suddenly something cracked that shell, would you even recognize yourself anymore? Because that is exactly what happened here. Simon himself admitted that becoming a dad made him happier, calmer, and more present. He even said it pulled him away from being obsessed with work all the time. That same man who once stayed up all night chasing ratings is now someone who values time at home. That is not just growth, that is transformation. And transformation always leaves clues. You see it in the way he speaks to contestants now. There is more encouragement, more patience. Even when he says no, it feels different, less like a shutdown and more like guidance. And for longtime viewers, it is almost surreal. Because this is the same man who once told people they had no future in music without blinking. Now he is the one fighting back tears when someone overcomes impossible odds just to stand on that stage. So what changed? The show or the man? The answer is simple. The man changed. And once he did, everything else followed. But here is where it gets even more interesting. Because if this mirror of empathy is real, if Eric truly became that emotional anchor in Simon's life, then it raises a bigger question. Does fatherhood actually change a person? Or does it just reveal who they were always capable of being? Think about that for a second. Was Simon always capable of this level of empathy, and it just took the right moment to unlock it? Or did becoming a father completely rewrite the way he experiences the world? Either way, one thing is clear. The version of Simon Cowell we see today is not an act. It is not a rebrand. It is the result of something deeply personal. And once you understand that, those emotional moments on stage stop feeling like television. They start feeling like glimpses into a man who finally allowed himself to feel. And that is a much more powerful story than any rumor could ever create. The future of the Cowell dynasty. And once you see that shift, once you understand where that empathy comes from, the next question almost asks itself. With the villain persona officially retired, what does the next chapter look like for the world's most famous judge? Because, let's be honest, the old version of Simon Cowell is not coming back. The late nights, the constant pressure, the obsession with ratings, the version of him that could stay awake until 4 a.m. chasing perfection. That chapter has already closed, and not quietly. It ended with burnout. It ended with physical pain. It ended with a moment where his own body forced him to stop. And if you look closely, that moment might have saved him. Because what replaces a life built on pressure when you finally let it go? For Simon, the answer seems surprisingly simple. Time. Not time in the studio, not time in meetings, but time at home, time with Eric, time doing things that would have sounded almost impossible for him 20 years ago. He has openly admitted that becoming a father changed how he lives day to day. He no longer wants to be the guy who is constantly working, constantly chasing the next big thing. Instead, he is present, more grounded, more aware of what actually matters. And you can see it in small details, the way he talks about his son, the way he describes their routines, the way he smiles when he mentions things that have nothing to do with television. And here is where it gets a little unexpected. Because while Simon stepped away from that intense lifestyle, something else started to grow right in front of him. Eric, not just as his son, but as a personality. There are moments, especially in rare behind-the-scenes clips, where you start to notice it. The confidence, the curiosity, the way he observes things. It is almost like watching a younger version of Simon, just without the sharp edges. And yes, there is a bit of humor in it too, because imagine being Simon Cowell, a man known for judging talent across the world, and then realizing your toughest critic might one day be your own child. What happens when the student grows up in the master's house? That is the quiet question sitting in the background of this entire story. Some people believe Eric might follow in his father's footsteps, that he could step into the world of entertainment, maybe even television. And if you look at the environment he is growing up in, it is not a crazy idea. He is surrounded by it. He sees it up close. He understands it in a way most kids never will. But here is the twist. Simon does not seem obsessed with that outcome. And that says everything. Because the old Simon would have planned it, controlled it, designed the future like a business strategy. The new Simon? He seems content just letting Eric be a kid. And that might be the biggest transformation of all. Letting go of control. Letting go of the need to shape everything. Letting life unfold without turning it into a project. That is not something you learn from success. That is something you learn from almost losing yourself. And when you connect that back to everything we have talked about, the long nights, the pressure, the emotional shift, it becomes clear. This is not just a career evolution. This is a life reset. So what does the future actually look like for the Cowell dynasty? It looks quieter, not small, but intentional. Simon is still involved in television, still shaping shows, still influencing the industry. But it no longer feels like he is chasing something. It feels like he is choosing what matters. And that is a big difference, because when you stop chasing, you start deciding. And those decisions now seem to revolve around balance, health, family, stability, things that the old version of him barely had time to think about. There is also something else worth noticing: his relationship with risk. The Simon who once pushed himself to extremes, physically and mentally, has already paid the price for that lifestyle. His back injury became a wake-up call, a moment where everything slowed down whether he wanted it to or not. And instead of rushing back into the same pattern, he adjusted, he changed, he listened. How many people actually do that when life forces them to stop? That is why this chapter matters. Because it is not just about what he built. It is about what he chose to walk away from. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant need to prove something. That is the real emotional goodbye people misunderstood from the beginning. It was never about losing someone. It was about letting go of a version of himself that was slowly breaking him. And in its place, something new is growing. A father, a mentor. A man who finally seems comfortable being more than just a brand. So now the question shifts one last time. Are we witnessing the birth of a new TV mogul in Eric, someone who might one day carry that legacy forward? Or are we simply watching a father who finally figured out what success actually means? Maybe it is both. Maybe the real legacy is not the shows, the ratings, or the fame. Maybe it is the fact that the man who once built an empire on judging others has learned how to show up for the one person who matters most. And if that is true, then the future of the Cowell dynasty is not just about entertainment. It is about something much quieter, something much harder to measure, but something far more powerful. A life that finally makes sense. But here's the truth most people miss. This was never a story about loss. It was about awakening. Simon didn't just change, he chose to. He walked away from the darkness to stand in his son's light. And now, the real question is, which version do you believe in more? The old judge or the father he became? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. Like and subscribe for more hidden truths.